For as long as we have been aware of their existence, people all over the world have displayed an intense fascination with dinosaurs. Discoveries of their fossilized remains likely help inspire the legend of the dragon, the monstrous, sometimes winged reptile which features in traditional folklore from China to Mexico. The wild popularity of the Jurassic Park franchise demonstrates our enduring interest in these kings of the Mesozoic, and our deep, primitive gratitude that they no longer walk the earth. And many young boys and girls go through a dinosaur phase, characterized by an all-consuming obsession with these primordial monsters. The academic community in North America and Europe went through its own dino phase in the mid to late 19th century, after English paleontologist Sir Richard Owen, in 1942, first used the Greco-Latin compound word Dinosaurus, or terrible lizard, as a denotation for the ancient reptiles whose petrified skeletons were being unearthed in England, Holland, and Germany. Victorian dinosaur mania veritably exploded a decade later, when Owen commissioned British sculptor Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins with creating life-size sculptures of 33 dinosaurs, which were based upon Owen's interpretations of the handful of fossils that had been unearthed at that time. The sculptures were completed in 1854, and were unveiled with great pomp and ceremony during the grand opening of a prehistoric-themed park constructed outside the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace being a portable glass and iron building, which had housed London's Great Exhibition, the First World Fair, back in 1851. Catalyzed by the popularity of the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, museums across Great Britain and the United States raced to populate their display rooms with the largest and most impressive dinosaur skeletons money could buy, which they purchased from independent and fiercely competitive paleontologists. Hand in hand with the dinomania of Western academia came fictional tales of lost worlds, inhabited by the primeval monsters that had inflamed Victorian imagination. In 1864, French novelist Jules Verne published Journey to the Center of the Earth, a French literary classic in which an eccentric German scientist and his nephew discover a subterranean ocean deep beneath Iceland, teeming with aquatic dinosaurs. In 1888, Canadian writer James DeMille's fantasy romance, a strange manuscript found in a copper cylinder, was published posthumously in serial format in Harper's Weekly magazine, telling the story of a thermally heated, semi-tropical oasis in Antarctica, where dinosaurs roam. In 1898, English novelist C.J. Cutcliffe Hine published The Lizard, a short story about an English gentleman who discovered and battled a carnivorous dinosaur in a cave near the English village of Kettlewell. The following year, American writer Warden Allen Curtis's science fiction short story, The Monster of Lake Lametri, was published in the September issue of Pearson's magazine. Curtis's piece is written as the lost diary of a physician who discovered a living plesiosaur in a mountain lake in Wyoming, into the skull of which he transplanted the brain of his dying teenage companion. And in 1912, British author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle published his science fiction novel The Lost World, in which an ambitious young reporter accompanies an indomitable professor on an expedition to a remote stretch of South American jungle, which supports a robust population of pterodactyls. While dinosaur mania took Victorian culture by storm, a contemporaneous but unrelated furor gripped the Western mercantile world. As a consequence of the Industrial Revolution and the political upheavals that characterized the Age of Revolution, a wealthy upper-middle class composed of industrialists, doctors, lawyers, bankers, military officers, and other white-collar professionals grew throughout the 19th century. Many members of this burgeoning social strata flaunted their new wealth and standing by furnishing their drawing rooms with pianos, or pianofortes as they were known at the time, luxuries which were once affordable only to the aristocracy. It became fashionable for middle-class women and girls to study piano performance, an avocation redolent of high status and good breeding, and soon pianos were also making their way into the bedrooms of middle-class ladies throughout the Western world. The 52 white keys adorning every piano in the Victorian era were covered with veneers of ivory, and in order to supply that ivory, a brisk trade in elephant tusks flourished in West and East Africa. The rising demand for ivory was concurrent with a decreased demand for fur, as men throughout the Western world began to prefer silk top hats to the beaver felt headgear affected by their fathers and grandfathers. some far-sighted fur traders throughout North America, Alaska, and Siberia, eager to adapt to the changes affecting the Victorian market, began to purchase the tusks of woolly mammoths from the natives who had once brought them furs, those ancient ivory appendages being surprisingly common in the North Country, ensconced in the ever-eroding clay of riverbanks across the subarctic. Throughout the course of their boreal wanderings, many of the ivory prospectors who hunted for these antediluvian relics came across partially preserved mammoth carcasses mummified by the permafrost. In 1806, for example, zoologist M.F. Adams of the Russian Academy of Sciences learned that the body of a frozen mammoth had been discovered by Yakutian hunters on the banks of the Lena River in Siberia, with one eye still in its socket and its brain still in its skull. Despite that much of the mammoth's flesh was subsequently devoured by wild wolves and hungry Yakutian sled dogs, Adams managed to secure a portion of the animal's hide, which was so heavy that 10 strong men were needed to drag it to their boat on the riverbank. In 1848, a Russian Orthodox missionary named Kitrovo allegedly discovered the frozen body of a mammoth on the banks of the Kolyma River in northeastern Siberia, with food still in its stomach and twigs still in its mouth. And in 1898, a prospector named Angus Graham reputedly came across the remains of a mammoth encased in ice somewhere in Yukon territory, which disintegrated when it was exposed to the air. In the late 1800s, prospectors, fur traders, and ivory hunters began returning from the wilderness of northern Canada and Alaska with tales of living mammoths. In the May 5, 1889 issue of the Philadelphia Press, for example, a fur trader named Cola F. Fowler described his 1887 purchase of what appeared to be a fresh mammoth tusk from a native chief. When questioned, the chief informed him that he and his band had encountered a small mammoth herd north of Nome, Alaska, and that some of his hunters killed an old bull and a cow with their large caliber muskets. The March 4, 1893 issue of the Sitka-based newspaper The Alaska contained an article describing a Tahltan hunter's recent brush with a woolly mammoth in the valley of the Stickeen River in northwest British Columbia. And an article in the October 1899 issue of McClure's magazine told a fantastic tale, which was later proven to be a hoax, regarding a successful mammoth hunt in the early 1890s in the Alaskan wilderness. On April 15, 1908, an incredible article entitled Le Monstre de Partridge Creek, or The Monster of Partridge Creek, appeared in the French popular science magazine Je sais tout. Later that year, an English translation of the same piece appeared in the July 1908 edition of the Strand magazine, a British publication which printed both factual articles and fictional stories. As a literary phenomenon, The Monster of Partridge Creek was the perfect marriage of the two different genres of literature above described, namely fictional tales of living dinosaurs and ostensibly non-fictional accounts of prehistoric monsters in the North Country. Specifically, the piece describes an alleged encounter with a dinosaur in Canada's Yukon territory. The Monster of Partridge Creek was written by a Frenchman named Georges Dupuy, whom Wikipedia identifies as 50-year-old Dr. Georges-Marie Dupuy, a hard-headed Parisian physician and anatomical illustrator, respected in the medical community for his contributions to the field of combat surgery. In fact, the author of the piece was almost certainly the doctor's contemporaneous namesake and fellow Parisian, a 34-year-old journalist, writer, and translator who regularly contributed to the French sporting magazine L'Auto. In addition to writing articles on boxers, sprinters, and other athletes for the aforementioned publication, Georges Dupuy wrote at least one other short story for Je sais tout, which is set in Canada's Yukon territory. Dupuy was a stampeder who had participated in the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897. In a saloon in Dawson City, the heart of Klondike country, he became acquainted with fellow writer Jack London, future author of the American literary classics White Fang and The Call of the Wild. Like London, Dupuy spent much of his time in Dawson, plying old sourdoughs for tales of their backcountry adventures. Dupuy made several trips from Paris to Yukon and Alaska in the decade following his prospecting days. On one such foray, which he undertook as a correspondent for L'Auto, he traveled to Nome, Alaska to report on the condition of the Bering Strait sea ice, over which some quixotic industrialists hope to build a highway, the most difficult stretch of a hypothetical thoroughfare connecting New York with Moscow. Just before twilight, he reported, some 2 miles or less distant, we could see the little blue waves out there in the Bering Sea. Not once did it freeze more than 5 miles out at Nome. but there are periods when the strait freezes," unquote. In 1904, Jack London hired Dupuy to translate his short story anthology, The Faith of Men and Other Stories, into French. In a letter to his friend and publisher, George Platt Brett Sr., in which he attempted to convince Brett that Dupuy was the man for the job, London wrote, quote, "Mr. Georges Dupuy is a Frenchman, an artist, a journalist, and a man who knows Alaska better than I do. He has lived the life. I call him an artist, and by the word I mean not painter but temperament. He sees. From my talks with him, I see that he has the romance, the fire, the color, the idiom of the land," unquote. Despite London's praise for the keenness of his mind's eye, Dupuy was quick to assure his readers that the events described in The Monster of Partridge Creek were witnessed by the physical eyes in his head. "The story which follows is in no sense a romance," he began. "I wish in the first place to ask the readers of the following narrative to believe that I am in no way attempting to impose upon their credulity. Concerning the amazing spectacle I am about to describe, I report nothing but plain facts, however astounding and apparently incredible they may seem at first glance, precisely as they appeared to my own eyes," unquote. Dupuy went on to explain how, in the early 1900s, one of his favorite Yukon haunts was a place called McQuestion Post. Although a trading post of that name once existed at the confluence of the Stewart and Yukon rivers, Dupuy hints in his story that the McQuestion Post to which he referred was the Northwest Mounted Police Station which lay at the southern shores of the Stewart River, opposite the mouth of McQuestion Creek, about 75 kilometers or 47 miles west of the town of Mayo, and 106 kilometers or 66 miles southeast of Dawson. Dupuy's friend, a French-Canadian Jesuit missionary named Father Pierre Lavenu, who tended to the spiritual needs of a nearby band of Clayoquot Indians, owned a cabin at McQuestion Post, which Dupuy visited every time he was in the area. One morning in the early 1900s, the story goes, Dupuy was enjoying a cup of coffee on the veranda of Father Lavenue's cabin when he heard a whistle from the direction of the Stewart River. The Frenchman glanced up from his mug and was delighted to see his friend James Lewis Butler kneeling in a bark canoe with an Indian at his fore and rear. The three men paddled over to the shore. Butler was a San Francisco banker who had left California in 1897 to try his luck in the Klondike. Dupuy knew that Butler had spent the past few months prospecting in the wild country north of the Stewart River, and was eager to learn whether he had met with any success. Butler's greatest discovery, Dupuy soon learned, had nothing to do with gold dust or nuggets. Just 2 days earlier, the banker had been making his way overland towards the Stewart River when he came upon a cabin belonging to a man named Grant, who invited him to stay the night. The following morning, Grant asked Butler if he would like to accompany him and two companions on a moose hunt. Butler agreed, and the four men headed to Partridge Creek, a tributary of the Stewart, which empties into the latter about 6 kilometers downstream from the mouth of the McQuestion River. The hunters made their way up a hill overlooking a mineral lick off Partridge Creek, where moose and caribou often came to taste the salt. Sure enough, they spied 3 enormous moose grazing in the valley below. Before any of the hunters could get off a shot, one of the animals, a young bull, let out a sharp bellow and crashed into the southerly bush, followed closely by his mates. We decided to approach the spot where the animals had taken fright so suddenly, Butler told Dupuy. Quote, arriving at the moose lick, a spot about 60 feet long and 15 feet wide, we saw in the mud, and almost on a level with the water of the lick, the fresh imprint of a body of a monstrous animal. Its belly had made an impression in the slime more than 2 feet deep, 30 feet long, and 12 feet wide. 4 gigantic paws, also deeply impressed, had left at the end of each imprint, and a little to the side, footprints 5 feet long by 2.5 feet wide, the claws being more than a foot long, the sharp points of which had buried themselves deeply in the mud. There was also the print, apparently, of a heavy tail, 10 feet long and 16 inches wide at the point, unquote. In the French language version of the story, Butler claimed that he and his companions found an enormous pile of strange greenish manure, which was clearly produced by some massive carnivorous animal, lying in the middle of the trail. This ominous excrement terrified the Indians. Butler and his companions followed the mysterious tracks for about 5 or 6 miles, along the wooded banks of Partridge Creek, until the coulee sharpened into a steep gulch. There, the tracks abruptly ended, quote, as if by enchantment, unquote. At the conclusion of Butler's incredible tale, Dupuy suggested that the two of them assemble a hunting party and locate the mysterious creature that had made the tracks. By evening, Father Pierre Lavenu, a local miner named Tom Leemore, who was working a claim on the McQuestion River, and 5 Cleacuck Indians agreed to accompany Butler and Dupuy on their excursion. The Mounties who manned McQuestion Post, and a courier who was staying in the area, both of whom were skeptical of Butler's story, decided to remain behind with Butler's 2 Indian guides. Early the following morning, at about 5 o'clock, the hunters paddled across the Stewart River in canoes and headed into the forest. They searched for signs of their mysterious quarry all day, slogging through brush and muskeg as they explored both Partridge Creek and the easterly McQuestion River, making their way north towards their headwaters in a nameless range of snow-capped mountains, but to no avail. The elusive creature was nowhere to be seen. That evening, the 9 companions set up camp at the crest of a cliff overlooking Partridge Creek and got a fire going. As they were boiling a pot of tea, the sound of falling stones could be heard in the ravine below. Before any of the men could investigate the commotion, a primeval roar ripped through the valley. Gripping their rifles with trembling hands, Dupuy and his companions crawled over to the edge of the cliff and peered into the ravine. Across the narrow valley, on the opposite side of Partridge Creek, an enormous grayish-black creature was attempting to ascend the opposite slope. As it struggled to gain purchase on the rocky hillside with its clawed feet, it sent boulders crashing into the valley below. Dupuy estimated that the monster measured 50 feet from its nose to the end of its tail, and that the crest of its spine stood 18 feet above the ground. Its snout was, quote, surmounted by a horn like that of a rhinoceros, while its hide was like that of a wild boar, garnished with thick bristles, unquote. Red slaver dripped from its jaws. The monster had apparently just finished its dinner. In the English version of the tale, Father Lavenu declared that the creature must be a dinosaur. In the French version, the Jesuit, through chattering teeth, identified the monster as a Ceratosaurus, a dinosaur on which American paleontologist Othniel Charles Marsh had written extensively throughout the 1880s and 90s. The hunters watched the strange animal for a full 10 minutes, transfixed to the spot by both fear and fascination. We were in full possession of our senses, Dupuy wrote. There was not, and never will be, in our minds the least doubt as to the reality of what we saw. It was indeed a living creature, and not an illusion, which we had before us, unquote. Finally, when the creature recognized the futility of its exercise, it quit the slopes and bounded into the valley of Partridge Creek on 2 legs, moving with astonishing agility. Following their terrifying encounter, Dupuy and Butler made a trip to Dawson City, where they entreated the Commissioner of Yukon Territory for mules and 50 armed men with which to destroy the monster of Partridge Creek. Here my story ends, Dupuy wrote. For a month we were the laughingstock of the Golden City, and the Dawson Daily Nugget published an article about me, which was at the same time flattering and satirical, entitled Arrival of Poe, unquote. Near the beginning of the article, Georges Dupuy reproduced the contents of a letter that he claimed to have received from his friend Father Lavenu, which was written on New Year's Day 1908. After expressing his, quote, affectionate wishes for Dupuy's health and happiness, unquote, and informing Dupuy of the death of John Spitz, the mail carrier for the Duncan district northeast of Mayo, the priest disclosed that on New Year's Eve, just a week prior, he and 10 members of his native congregation had seen the monster of Partridge Creek a second time, racing over the frozen surface of the creek with the caribou clamped between its jaws. His fur was covered with hoarfrost, he wrote, and his little eyes gleamed like fire in the twilight, unquote. The priest estimated that the animal ran at a speed exceeding 10 miles an hour, and noted that the temperature at the time of the sighting was 45 degrees below zero, that's minus 49 degrees Fahrenheit. Accompanied by a local Indian chief and 2 of his sons, Father Lavenu followed the animal's steadily fading tracks 2 miles to the Stewart River, where the trail finally disappeared under a blanket of freshly fallen snow. Many of those who have commented upon the monster of Partridge Creek believe that it was intended as a work of fiction. In his 2017 article, A Brief History of Cowboys and Dinosaurs, American comic book artist Stephen R. Bissett described the story as, quote, "one slice of great northern Yukon Territory fiction. Well, I'm convinced it's fiction, which has become enshrined as the real thing by certain cryptozoology circles," unquote. American cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman echoed Bassett's statement in a May 27, 2020 Twitter post, referring to the piece as, quote, "pure #cryptofiction set in Canada," unquote. Regardless of whether or not the story itself is true, the monster of Partridge Creek was clearly presented as a non-fictional account of an actual dinosaur sighting in the Yukon. In the Strand magazine, it is sandwiched between various non-fictional pieces, such as 34-year-old Winston Churchill's account of his parliamentary service in Uganda, and a variety of obviously fictional short stories, like a supernatural mystery by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle involving an overworked accountant and a haunted Scottish mirror. The magazine's editor firmly placed Dupuy's story in the non-fiction camp by giving it the headline, "Stories Strange and True." Then, as if to dispel any remaining doubt as to its veracity, he added a short preamble, a direct translation of its French counterpart in Je sais tout, in which he declared that the story's author is, quote, "a well-known French writer and traveler, whose good faith is beyond question, and who takes full responsibility for his narrative, which, it may be noted, however remarkable, is in no way contradicted by known scientific facts," unquote. Subsequent to its debut in the Strand magazine and Je sais tout, The Monster of Partridge Creek was republished in newspapers throughout North America. The verbiage of these reprints often deviated slightly from the original, undergoing a subtle kind of rewording to which non-fictional news articles are often subjected, but to which fictional pieces are invariably immune. Some articles declared that Tom Lemore had taken 3 photographs of the creature during the encounter which Dupuy described. Galvanized by the sensational articles, 29-year-old Hugh Grosvenor, the wealthy Duke of Westminster, reportedly planned a hunting trip in Yukon Territory for the express purpose of bagging the monster of Partridge Creek. In preparation for his upcoming adventure, the Duke allegedly chartered a German steamer at Hamburg and fitted it with a huge steel cage in which the beast was to be contained. His plans were ultimately foiled in 1914, when the Great War broke out in the Old World. The Duke volunteered for combat duty and served with distinction in a prototypical armored car squadron on the front lines in Egypt. By the time the war was over, he had apparently forgotten about his intended Yukon expedition, or had a change of heart or circumstance, and never rescheduled his trip to Stewart River country. Although the monster of Partridge Creek was certainly presented, and initially received by many as a true story, its context in literary history suggests that it was very possibly fictional in nature. Despite that, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's novel The Lost World had not yet been published at the time the story was penned, inspiration for a tale of prehistoric survivors was in ample supply in 1908. Verne, DeMille, Hine, and Curtis had already introduced living dinosaur fiction to the reading public, and American newspapers abounded with tales of mammoths and mastodons that roamed the frozen wastes of the subarctic. Perhaps most tellingly, Jack London's anthology, The Faith of Men, which Dupuy translated into French in 1904, included a tale entitled A Relic of the Pliocene. In this short story, the narrator encounters a lonely frontiersman deep in the subarctic bush, who tells him a campfire story about a live woolly mammoth, perhaps the last of its kind on Earth, which he encountered in a remote valley in what is presumably the Mackenzie Mountains of Canada's Northwest Territories. When the monster broke his gun and killed his dog, the frontiersman made it his mission to slaughter it. He accomplished this feat through persistence hunting, and celebrated his victory by crafting a pair of mucklucks from the mammoth's hide. If the monster of Partridge Creek indeed constitutes a piece of northwestern fiction, it was not Georges Dupuy's first foray into the genre. 2 years earlier, he wrote a French-language story entitled Un drame à Klondike, or A Drama in the Klondike, which was published in the February 15, 1906 issue of Je sais tout. This story tells of a French-Canadian prospector who murdered 2 of his fellow countrymen in the subarctic for their gold, only to be driven away from his prize by his victims' vengeful sled dogs. Its context in literary history is not the only indication that the monster of Partridge Creek might be a fictional creation. In the very first paragraph, Dupuy refers to the Indians of the Stewart River as members of the Clayoquot tribe. In his French-language version, he implies that the Clayoquots comprise a band of Snow Indians, the Snow Indians perhaps being a general denotation for the Dene. In fact, the natives of Stewart River Country are members of the Northern Shoshone First Nation, no bands of which go by a name bearing any resemblance to the word Clayoquot. The Koyukuk Indians, on the other hand, whose name the word Clayoquot strongly evokes, are members of a subdivision of the Koyukon Nation, whose historical homeland lies in central Alaska, far from the Stewart River. Dupuy's inclusion of the Clayoquot Indians in his narrative, considering his intimate familiarity with the North Country, almost seems to be a subtle wink to his sourdough friends, to whom such an error, unnoticed by the vast majority of readers, might seem glaringly obvious. Dupuy's friend Jack London inserted a similar inside joke into his novel The Call of the Wild, with his inclusion of the murderous and completely fictitious Yihat Indians. Similar to the Clayoquot Indians, this author has failed to find any references to Father Pierre Lavenue, James Lewis Butler, and Tom Lemore in any books, academic articles, newspapers, or online posts aside from those related to Dupuy's story. In a commentary on the monster of Partridge Creek, published in the September 1908 issue of the Knowledge and Illustrated Scientific News, English naturalist Richard Lydekker wrote, quote, that a living representative of the carnivorous dinosaurs of the secondary epoch should be living in the frozen north of Alaska seems incredible to every scientific mind. The prima facie presumption is that larger dinosaurs were inhabitants of warm rather than of Arctic zones, unquote. British cryptozoologist Carl Schuker, who was perhaps the first in his field to critique the story, expressed a similar opinion in his 1995 book In Search of Prehistoric Survivors, writing, quote, the monster of Partridge Creek merits a prominent place among the Dubatanda of cryptozoology. Bearing in mind that the existence of such an animal calls for our belief in the post-Cretaceous persistence of an endothermic hairy dinosaur in what must surely be the last compatible habitat for any type of large reptile living today, its lack of cryptozoological credibility should hardly come as a great surprise, unquote. Conversely, British journalist and Fortean writer Harold T. Wilkins, in his 1952 book Secret Cities of Old South America, argued that Dupuy's story, and the concept of relict Arctic dinosaurs in general, might not be as far-fetched as most readers might reflexively assume. Paleontologists, he wrote, tell us that one of the principal reasons for the disappearance of dinosaurs, and the monstrous reptilian of the great swamps and warm mosses of the hot Mesozoic age, life's long summer on the Earth, was the oncoming of the Ice Age. After recurring periods of cold and less warmth, they say, the monsters died out, leaving no descendants. Yes, doubtless that was so, but who may say whether or not a peculiar type of dinosaur, existing in the Mesozoic age, was able to adapt himself to changing climates and survive, unquote. Indeed, since the 1980s, paleontologists have discovered dinosaur fossils in both the Arctic and Antarctic circles, indicating that some dinosaurs were able to survive in colder temperatures than previously believed. The finds are coming fast and furious, wrote science writer Riley Black in a December 3, 2020 article for the Smithsonian Magazine. Quote, a tiny jaw found in Alaska's ancient rock record, and written about in July, indicates that dinosaurs nested in these places and stayed year-round. The ongoing identification of new species, not found anywhere else, highlights how some dinosaurs adapted to the cold, unquote. Similar to their modern avian counterparts, paleontologists hypothesize that these creatures acclimated to lower temperatures by growing fuzz or downy feathers, going into torpor in underground burrows, or annually migrating to warmer climes in autumn. One potential hole in Dupuy's story is the imprint that the monster's tail purportedly left in the mineral lick, as described by James Butler. Some writers have interpreted this detail as an indication that the dinosaur dragged its tail when it walked. This interpretation is probably incorrect, considering that the tail mark is only mentioned in connection with the massive imprint of what was suspected to be the dinosaur's belly, which the creature presumably made while wading through the soft, deep mud of the mineral lick. If the mud reached the creature's belly, then it doubtless would have reached its tail as well, whether it was dragging or not. Whatever the case, the notion of a tail-dragging dinosaur accords perfectly with the mainstream Victorian and Edwardian perception of dinosaur biomechanics, which held that dinosaurs dragged their tails on the ground when they walked. In the 1970s, however, during a paleontological paradigm shift known as the Dinosaur Renaissance, American paleontologist Robert T. Backer proposed that theropods like Ceratosaurus were active creatures which used their tails to balance themselves while they ran. The paleontological community generally concurred with Backer's revolutionary theory, and today, nearly every interpretation of bipedal dinosaurs, from museum skeletons to movie monsters, depict these ancient creatures with their tails in the air. In recent years, theories on dinosaur locomotion have begun to come full circle, with the discovery of what have been interpreted as dinosaur tail drag marks, clear indications that some dinosaurs did indeed drag their tails when they walked, as Victorian scientists initially suspected. In 1922, newspapers across North America reported that a family of carnivorous dinosaurs resembling Ceratosauri had been spotted in the Soviet Union's Kamchatka Peninsula. Indigenous hunters allegedly discovered the mangled remains of a young Ceratosaurus in Russia's boreal wilderness, and brought one of its severed feet, which was the size of a man's head, back to civilization. Some journalists who commented upon the story suggested that these alleged Russian dinosaurs might be kin to the monster of Partridge Creek, speculating that such creatures might cross the Bering Strait during especially severe winters, when Kamchatka and Chukotka were linked to Alaska by an unbroken stretch of ice. When a subsequent expedition in search of the Russian dinosaurs proved fruitless, some suggested that the prehistoric remnants abode within the Tusks Mountains, a range newly discovered in northeastern Siberia, between the Yana and Indigirka rivers. Throughout the 1930s, Canadian writer and former Hudson's Bay Company inspector Philip H. Godsell wrote a number of articles in which he included a story that had been told to him by his friend Frank Beaton, the HBC's chief factor at Fort St. John, British Columbia. Beaton had heard the story from a scientific party, whose members had heard it from one of their Indian guides, a Cree named Chequina, who had, in turn, heard the tale from his father. Sometime in the late 19th or early 20th centuries, Chequina's father had purportedly traveled to the Upper Liard River country, in what is now southeastern Yukon, where he fell in with a primitive tribe of Dene Indians. Around their fires, Godsell wrote, these Stone Age people had told of a medicine valley to the north, inhabited by monsters of fearful size and ferocity, unquote. One of the Cree's new Dene acquaintances produced a scrap of buckskin from his medicine bag, on which had been burned the image of one of these monsters. The Cree treasured the charm for years, and eventually bequeathed it to his son Chequina, who, in turn, showed it to the scientific party he was tasked with guiding. The scientists told an incredulous Beaton that the figure depicted on the buckskin scrap was a dinosaur, drawn in flawless anatomical detail. The world will never know what Georges Dupuy's opinions might have been on the alleged Ceratosauri of Siberia, the story of Chequina's buckskin drawing, and the controversy that his tale engendered. The journalist died prematurely in 1911, just 3 years after the publication of his most contentious article, bringing the secret of Partridge Creek with him to the grave. Paleontologists, cryptozoologists, and literary historians can speculate all they like as to whether his tale has any truth at its core. But until definite answers in some long-forgotten letter or long-lost journal are discovered and brought to public awareness, the monster of Partridge Creek will remain one of the great unsolved mysteries of Canada.